Ladies and gentlemen, there are truths we carry not in our words but in our silence. In the quiet corners of our behavior, in the patterns we repeat without knowing, in the moments that betray our composure, there the past lives on. Trauma is not always loud, it does not always arrive dressed in catastrophe. Sometimes, it whispers. It hides beneath politeness, perfectionism and withdrawal. It molds us in silence, crafting responses and feel like instinct but are, in truth, protection. Today, I invite you to walk with me. Not into the trauma itself but into the subtle signs it leaves behind. Let us name them, not to judge but to understand. Not to pathologize, but to bring into consciousness what the soul has long hidden in shadow. The person who over-apologizes does not merely express regret, they offer themselves up for correction, as if their very presence were an inconvenience. "I'm sorry" becomes not a response to harm done, but a habitual prelude to every request, every movement, every expression of need. This habit is often meant as politeness or humility, but beneath it lies something far more complex. An emotional reflex rooted in early experiences where one's sense of safety was bound to appeasement. They learned, whether through words or silence, that being too visible, too loud, or too assertive triggered negative consequences. Perhaps love was withdrawn when they were too much, perhaps anger followed every expression of need. And so, the child adapted. They learned to apologize not just for their mistakes but for their existence. To such a person, apology is not merely about righting a wrong, it is a way of life. It becomes a shield, an effort to preempt disapproval, to prevent conflict before it arises, to shrink the self into something that feels acceptable to others. In a room full of people, they instinctively read the mood, adjust their tone, their posture, their words. If someone frowns, they wonder what they did wrong. If someone seems distant, they assume responsibility. This constant self-monitoring, this endless dance of emotional calibration is exhausting, but it feels safer than being authentically seen. The roots of this behavior often stretch back to environments where emotional expression are frisky or discouraged. Perhaps the child grew up with volatile caregivers, where even minor infractions led to disproportionate reactions. In such a space, the nervous system becomes attuned to subtle shifts in tone, facial expression, or energy. The child learns to anticipate danger and prevent it. Over-apologizing becomes one of the ways to manage the unpredictable, to smooth over tension before it escalates. As they grow older, this pattern continues. Not because it's still necessary, but because it has become embedded in the psyche. The body reacts before the mind has time to intervene. There is also an element of shame that lingers in the background of this habit. It is not the healthy shame that comes from recognizing one's limitations or making amends. It is toxic shame, the deeply held belief that one is inherently wrong, inherently flawed. When a person feels this at their core, they begin to approach the world through the lens of guilt. Every interaction becomes a potential source of failure. They apologize for taking up space, for asking questions, for having needs. It's as if they believe their very existence requires justification. They are uncomfortable being the subject, preferring instead to recede into the background, where they cannot be judged or rejected. Ironically, the people who over-apologize are often deeply empathetic and sensitive to the emotions of others. They are the ones who notice the unspoken discomfort in a conversation, who intuit when someone needs space, who absorb the energy of a room without effort. But this gift, when shaped by trauma, becomes a burden. Their sensitivity becomes hypervigilance, their compassion becomes self-erasure. And while the world may praise them for being thoughtful, inside they often feel unseen and unheard. They struggle to set boundaries, not because they don't know how, but because doing so feels like a betrayal of the role they were once forced to play. Releasing this pattern is not about silencing apologies altogether, but about reclaiming agency over when and why they are given. It means recognizing that not every discomfort is fought to fix, not every silence is a condemnation, not every feeling of guilt is a call to action. It requires the slow, courageous work of reparenting the self, of offering the inner child the validation they were once denied, and perhaps most of all, it requires learning to stand in the full weight of one's existence without shrinking, without softening, without saying sorry for being real. It is the quiet, steady unfolding of a self no longer afraid to take up space, the one who refuses help, who insists on doing everything alone, who turns down every offer of support not out of pride but as a default response, often carries a wound too old to name. To the outside world, this person appears strong, capable, even admirable in their self-reliance. But beneath that polished independence is often a deep mistrust, born not from cynicism but from disappointment. There was likely a time when their vulnerability was met with abandonment, betrayal, or ridicule. A time when they reached out and no one reached back, or worse, when their needs were used against them. And so they learned the most painful lesson that needing others is dangerous, and being dependent means being disappointed. In such cases, independence becomes armor. It is not a celebration of self-sufficiency, but a survival strategy dressed in competence. They do not say, "I don't need anyone," out of arrogance, but because needing someone once led to hurt they vowed never to repeat. They avoid asking for help not because they believe they can do it all, but because asking feels like exposure. It opens the door to the same pain they once promised themselves they would never feel again. So they carry their burdens silently, overextend themselves, push through exhaustion, and smile while doing it. Not because it's easy, but because it feels safer than depending on someone who not be there when it matters most. To trust, for them, is not a given. It must be earned over time, and even then, it is never absolute. They might open up in fragments, in small, cautious elations. But even in their closest relationships, there remains a hidden reserve, a part of themselves they guard fiercely. This is not because they are withholding by nature, but because they are protecting the part of them that once felt helpless and alone. Letting someone see that place again feels like standing on the edge of a cliff, unsure if the ground will hold their hyper. Independence may manifest in their work, their relationships, even in how they handle pain or illness. They may downplay struggles, dismiss compliments, change the subject when asked how they're doing. They believe, often unconsciously, that if they rely on no one they cannot be let down. But in protecting themselves from disappointment, they also close the door to genuine connection. To the kind of intimacy that comes not from do it all alone, but from being willing to be seen. Especially in moments of need, the person who constantly pleases does not simply want to be liked. They feel compelled to shape themselves according to what others expect, need, or demand, often at the expense of their own authenticity. To them, harmony is not a preference but a requirement, something essential to their sense of emotional safety. They may smile when they feel pain, say yes, when every fiber of their body screams, no, agree with opinions they internally reject, and abandon their own desires if those desires could possibly disrupt the comfort of those around them. This behavior can seem like kindness or selflessness on the surface, but beneath it often lies a subtle, long-ingrained fear. The fear that saying no means being unloved, that setting boundaries leads to rejection, that displeasing others will trigger consequences they are not equipped to handle. Often, this pattern is born in childhood, where emotional survival required compliance. In households marked by emotional volatility, neglect or conditional affection, the child quickly learns to read the room, to sense when anger is rising or disappointment is brewing. They become skilled in identifying what others want and adapting themselves accordingly. If love or attention came only when they were good, quiet, helpful, or agreeable, then they internalized a belief that their true self was not acceptable, that their role was to meet others' needs to earn a place in the room. Over time, this becomes not just behavior but identity. The idea of advocating for themselves or risking conflict begins to feel threatening. Even if the current environment is safe, people-pleasing also become method of control. Paradoxically, by keeping others happy, the pleaser can prevent conflict before it begins. They can avoid the discomfort of confrontation and the vulnerability of being disliked. But this comes at a cost. Their own needs are buried, not only from others but often from themselves. They become disconnected from what they truly feel, want, or believe. In relationships, they may feel resentment building silently as they continue to give more than they receive, yet struggle to name this imbalance because doing so feels selfish or disloyal. They often find themselves in dynamics where they are overextended, emotionally exhausted, and still afraid of disappointing someone. And when they finally do express frustration or set a boundary, it may erupt with more intensity than expected. Not because they are dramatic, but because the boundary has been suppressed for so long it bursts out instead of being spoken gently. There's also a deep loneliness inside the people-pleaser. Because if love was only offered to the version of them that pleased others, any wonder, often unconsciously, if anyone could love their full, unaided self. The more they perform a role, the less seen they feel. They may have many social connections, yet feel emotionally isolated, unsure if anyone truly knows them. And they often accept this loneliness because it feels safer than being vulnerable and rejected. To unlearn this pattern requires deep, patient work, the kind of inner work that invites the pleaser to stop asking, "What do they want me to be?" and start asking, "Who am I when I am not performing?" It means risking discomfort, speaking up, sitting with the anxiety that arises when someone is disappointed, and realizing that their worth is not tied to approval or acceptance. The person who fears conflict is not simply someone who prefers peace. They are someone for whom disagreement feels dangerous, whose nervous system interprets tension as a threat, regardless of the actual situation. When raised in an environment where anger was explosive or silence was weaponized, the child quickly learns that conflict is not a pathway to resolution, but a signal of something unstable, something unpredictable and potentially destructive. Instead of viewing disagreement as a natural part of communication, they begin to see it as a precursor to emotional harm, so they adapt. They become agreeable, deferential, careful with their words, often overanalyzing what to say and when to say it, hoping to avoid the emotional aftermath that once followed the smallest signs of discord in adulthood. This fear of conflict shows up in subtle but powerful ways. They hesitate to express opinions that might go against the group. They tolerate discomfort rather than risk confrontation. They say, "It's fine," when it's not, avoid hard conversations, and carry resentments quietly till they become too heavy to bear. And when faced with a situation that demands confrontation, a boundary being crossed, a need going unmet, they often freeze, deflect, or retreat entirely. This reaction isn't about weakness. It's the echo of an old strategy that once had survived emotionally chaotic environments, where conflict wasn't handled with care but with punishment, withdrawal, or instability. Often, these individuals become peacemakers, mediators, or caretakers in their relationships, because it allows them to control emotional temperatures, and avoid the discomfort of confrontation. They take on the emotional labor of others, absorb tension, and try to smooth over conflict before it escalates. But while their intentions are often rooted in kindness or empathy, they also come from a place of fear, the fear of being rejected, abandoned, or misunderstood. As a result, they may suppress their emotions to keep others comfortable. But deep down, this self-silencing creates distance between who they are and who they feel safe being. Over time, this disconnection leads to inner conflict, emotional exhaustion, and often, unexplained anxiety or depression that has no obvious. Paradox is that in avoiding external conflict, they create internal unrest. Their feelings have no outlet, their needs go unmet, and their boundaries slowly dissolve. They may become passive-aggressive without realizing it. Or they may erupt in unexpected moments with a force that surprises even themselves. Because when emotions are buried instead of expressed, they don't disappear, they simply find quieter, more insidious ways to make themselves known. And in relationships, this can lead to imbalances where others dominate decision-making or disrespect their boundaries, not necessarily out of malice, but because the person avoiding conflict has taught them, often unknowingly, that their needs and limits are negotiable or invisible. Learn the fear of conflict requires more than just learning to speak up. It requires healing the inner narrative that says disagreement equals danger. It means understanding that one can be direct without being cruel, assertive without being aggressive, honest without being rejected. It involves building the capacity to tolerate discomfort, trusting that relationships can survive friction, and believing that their voice has value even when it challenges the comfort of others. A person who lives with emotional numbness does not always know they are disconnected from their own feelings. In many cases, the absence of emotion has become so normal that they no longer remember what it felt like to truly feel. They move through life functioning on the surface, doing what needs to be done, saying the right words, showing up for others. But inside, there is a flatness, a sense of being distant from their own experience. Joy feels muted, sadness feels far away, and even love can feel like something they remember rather than something they are immersed in. This is not because they lack depth or empathy but because, somewhere along the way, their emotional system became overwhelmed and shut down as a form of protection. Often, this numbness originates in environments where emotions were dangerous, inconvenient, or ignored. If a child expressed pain and was met with indifference, or worse, punishment, they learned to stop expressing it. If they showed anger and were told they were bad, if they cried and were told to stop being dramatic, if they reached for comfort and were met with coldness, the message was internalized that emotions make them vulnerable in ways that are not safe. And so, the body, in its wisdom, began to suppress emotional responses not as a failure but as a survival strategy. When feelings became too much to bear, the system dulled them. When expression led to shame, the mind learned to silence the self. Over time, what began as protection became a state of being, so ingrained that it feels like the truth of who they are rather than the result of what they survived in adulthood. Emotional numbness can manifest in many forms. They may struggle to cry even when something deeply painful happens. They may feel disconnected from events that should stir something inside them. Birthdays, losses, moments of intimacy. They may respond to crisis with an eerie calm, not because they are strong but because their emotional system doesn't fully activate. They may describe themselves as numb, empty, or just going through the motions, yet find it difficult to explain this to others who see them as calm, composed, or even happy. Relationships can feel hollow, not because they don't care, but because the feeling of connection doesn't quite reach their heart, and while others might envy their steadiness, they often long for a sense of alienation out of reach. This disconnection can lead to a quiet kind of suffering. Because without access to the full range of emotions, life feels muted. The highs are never truly high, the lows are dulled but not gone, and the middle is often a long, gray stretch of indifference. They may try to break through the numbness through stimulation, seeking intensity in work, danger, substances, or relationships, anything to feel something again. But these are temporary, often self-destructive measures, because the core wound remains untouched. Reconnecting with feeling is slow, often uncomfortable work. It means creating safety where there was once danger. It means learning that emotion is not weakness, that vulnerability is not a threat, and that being fully alive includes the risk of being fully seen. The one who clings to perfectionism does not merely aim to do well. They are driven by a relentless, often invisible force that whispers that anything less than flawless is failure. That mistakes are not lessons but evidence of unworthiness. This pursuit is not about ambition or excellence in the purest, but about safety. Somewhere along their path, they learned that imperfection invited criticism, rejection, punishment or shame, and so they began to equate perfect with being accepted, being praised, being loved. To them, perfection is not just a standard. It is armor, a shield carefully constructed to protect the soft, vulnerable parts of themselves that once felt exposed and unprotected. This pattern often begins in environments where love or approval was conditional, where praise was given only when achievements met expectations, or where mistakes were magnified rather than met with understanding. The child internalizes the belief that their value lies not in who they are, but in what they can produce, accomplish, or perfect. And so, the smile they wear becomes practiced. Their words carefully chosen. Their performances rehearsed not for the joy of expression, but for the reassurance that they will not be criticized or abandoned. Every detail must be in order, every task done impeccably, every appearance managed with precision. Not out of vanity, but out of fear as they grow older. This perfectionism becomes embedded not only in their behavior but in their self-concept. They do not allow themselves to rest until everything is complete. They struggle to delegate because no one else can meet their impossible standards. They avoid situations where failure is even a possibility, because to fail, in their inner world is to confirm what they fear most, that they are not enough. And when they do stumble, they do not offer themselves the grace they so readily extend to others. Instead, they spiral into self-criticism, replaying the error again and again in their mind. Unable to release the belief that one flaw defines their worth. Relationships can become complicated for those ruled by perfectionism. They may struggle with vulnerability, fearing that if others see their imperfections, they will lose respect, admiration, or love. They may hold others to similarly high standards, creating distance when those expectations go unmet. Or they may attract partners who reinforce the belief that their value is tied to performance, effort, or compliance. Underneath it all is a longing not to be seen as perfect but to be accepted when they are not. Yet that desire feels too risky, too unfamiliar, too far from the identity they have constructed to keep emotionally safe. Letting go of perfectionism is not as simple as doing less or caring less. It is an act of profound inner courage. It requires confronting the old story that says love must be earned, that safety depends on being flawless, that rest is laziness, that failure is shame. It involves grieving the years spent striving to be enough through achievement, and slowly learning to be enough simply by being. It means welcoming the imperfect, the unfinished, the real self with the same compassion, once reserved only for the polished version they believed the world would accept. The one who struggles to trust others is not necessarily guarded by choice, but by necessity learned through painful experience. Trust, for them, is not a natural starting point but a risky endeavor that must be earned slowly, if ever. Beneath their caution lies a history that taught them to be skeptical of what people say, to question intentions even when they seem sincere, to wait for the other shoe to drop even in moments that appear safe. Somewhere in their past, there was a betrayal that left a mark too deep to simply move on from. Perhaps a parent who was inconsistent, a friend who turned away at a crucial moment, or a partner who broke promises while speaking words of love. That breach in the early blueprint of trust shaped the way they now navigate closeness and vulnerability. Not because they want to keep people out but because they don't know if anyone will truly stay. This lack of trust is often subtle, woven into the way they communicate and connect. They may listen more than they speak, carefully observing others for signs of danger or inconsistency. They may withhold parts of themselves, not because they are secretive, but because sharing feels like handing someone a weapon that could be used against them later. Even when someone proves reliable, they remain alert, scanning for signals that something is wrong, that a lie is being told, that affection is temporary. And when trust is finally extended, it is often laced with fear, not of the person themselves, but of being hurt in ways that feel familiar and irreversible in relationships. This dynamic can create distance that feels confusing to others. They may seem emotionally unavailable or hard to read, when in reality they are constantly wrestling with an inner conflict between the desire for connection and the fear of betrayal. They want to open up, to relax, to lean into the safety of another, but their body remembers what their mind tries to override. Their nervous system stays alert, interpreting closeness as risk rather than comfort. As a result, they may self-sabotage, push people away when things start to get serious, or remain in relationships that feel emotionally shallow because deeper intimacy feels too threatening. There is also often a layer of self-protection that makes admitting this fear of trust even harder. They may pride themselves on being independent, emotionally controlled, or rational, masking the deeper truth that their distrust is not strength but a scar. They have learned that people cannot always be relied upon, and so they rely only on themselves. While this stance may keep them from being hurt in the same way again, it also prevents them from experiencing the kind of connection that heals the original wound. Healing this fracture begins with acknowledging that the fear of trusting others is rooted in wisdom, not weakness. It once kept them safe, but what protected them may now be the very thing that prevents growth. Slowly, gently, they must begin to risk small acts of trust. To notice when someone shows up, to let their guard down in tiny increments that feel manageable. Not because everyone is trustworthy, but because they are learning to trust their own ability to discern, to cope, and to protect themselves without shutting the door on connection altogether. The one who startles easily, who seems constantly on edge, who scans every room they enter and notices every sudden movement or shift in tone, is not simply nervous or anxious by nature. They are living with a nervous system that has been trained to expect danger even when none is present. This state of heightened alertness, known as hypervigilance, is not a personality trait but a survival response that once served a critical purpose. It often begins in an environment where safety was not guaranteed, where the unpredictable ruled the emotional landscape, and where small cues, a slammed door, a shift in facial expression, the sound of footsteps, meant something was about to go wrong. In such spaces the body learns to stay ready. The mind becomes sharp at reading others but loses touch with its own peace. The heart races not because of present threats, but because the past still echoes through the body as if his hypervigilance is exhausting. But it becomes the baseline. They may appear calm on the outside, but internally they are assessing risk every moment. They sit with their back to the wall in public places. They keep one ear tuned for emotional changes in conversation. They prepare themselves mentally for the worst so they will not be caught off guard. Their body does not relax easily, even in moments meant to bring joy or rest, because relaxation feels unsafe. In fact, feeling calm can feel unfamiliar, even dangerous, because it lowers their defenses and makes them feel exposed. The nervous system, conditioned by past trauma, no longer responds to reality, it responds to memory. It overreacts not because it is flawed, but because it was once forced to adapt to chaos. This state of being is not limited to physical reactions. Emotionally, they may find it hard to trust that good things will last. They may fear that happiness will be followed by pain, that closeness will lead to abandonment, that success will be punished. So they stay alert, prepared for disappointment, ready to retreat at the first sign of threat. This constant readiness keeps them from fully engaging in their own life, from being present in relationships, from truly resting in the experience of now. They may not even realize they are doing it. It has become so automatic that it feels like who they are, when in truth it is something that was done to them. Others may misunderstand this state. They might see the flinch, the anxiety, the hesitation, and interpret it as overreacting or sensitivity. But they do not see the history behind it, the years of walking on eggshells, of bracing for impact, of trying to stay one step ahead of harm. The nervous system is doing exactly what it was trained to do, but the danger is no longer there. Healing, then, is not about telling the body to relax but about showing it again that it is finally safe. This requires patience, gentleness, and a willingness to meet the self with compassion instead of judgment. To understand that the body is not betraying them. It is protecting what once felt unbearably fragile. The individual who struggles with chronic self-doubt carries an internal dialogue that quietly but persistently questions their worth, their choices, and their place in the world. This self-doubt is not simply a matter of low confidence. It is a deep-seated voice shaped by past experiences where their sense of self was invalidated, criticized, or overlooked. In their early environment, they may have received messages, explicit or implicit, that they were not good enough, that their efforts were never quite sufficient, or that they needed to prove themselves constantly to earn acceptance or love. These messages seep into the core of their identity, leaving them to navigate life with a sense of uncertainty that shadows every decision and every accomplishment. This pervasive self-doubt manifests in hesitation, second-guessing, and an almost compulsive need for reassurance. Even when evidence shows their competence or worth, the internal critic dismisses these truths as luck, mistake, or fleeting approval. They may replay past failures endlessly, magnify them while minimizing their successes. This can create a cycle where fear of failure paralyzes action, and inaction only reinforces the belief that they are incapable. It is as if they live under a fog of uncertainty that clouds their view of themselves and the possibilities before them. Each step forward is accompanied by a whisper of doubt that asks, will this be enough? Will I be found out? Am I really worthy? Relationships can both soothe and exacerbate this struggle. On one hand, the desire to be seen and accepted is strong, but on the other, the fear of judgment or rejection can lead them to withdraw or mask their insecurities. They might avoid taking risks, sharing their true feelings, or voicing their opinions, worried that any misstep will confirm their inner narrative of inadequacy. This can create a loneliness that feels contradictory because they crave connection yet feel unworthy of it. Sometimes, they seek excessive validation from others to fill a void of self-trust. But this only deepens the dependence on external approval, making self-doubt even more entrenched. The roots of this pattern often lie in early relational wounds where care was conditional or inconsistent. Perhaps love came with strings attached. If you behave this way, I will love you. Or if you succeed, you will be proud. When acceptance depends on meeting standards rather than inherent being, the child grows into an adult who measures worth by achievement, approval, or comparison rather than self-acceptance. This leaves little room for mistakes or vulnerability, and creates a fragile sense of self that crumbles under pressure or criticism. Healing chronic self-doubt requires cultivating a different relationship with oneself. One that is built on compassion rather than judgment. It means recognizing that the inner critic's voice is not truth but a wounded part seeking attention. Learning to notice and challenge these negative beliefs, to embrace imperfections as part of being human, and to practice self-affirmation can slowly shift the internal landscape. This work is neither quick nor easy, because it involves dismantling years of conditioning, and confronting fears of abandonment and rejection. But through patience and gentle persistence, the person can begin to experience moments of self-trust, of confidence born not from external validation, but from an acceptance of their own intrinsic value. We are all in some way, shaped by the wounds we've carried. But the gift of awareness is the beginning of transformation. When we see our patterns not as flaws but as echoes of unmet needs, we begin to reclaim our wholeness. The task is not to be unscarred. The task is to bring the scar into the light, to meet the self with compassion, not condemnation. For in doing so, we do not just heal, we evolve. Thank you.